Welcome back to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the Hunter Biden plea deal, a Russian coup, and other international news. On Tuesday, Hunter Biden reached a deal with prosecutors. So Hunter Biden is the son of current President Joe Biden, and Hunter Biden will plead guilty to 2 misdemeanors over his failure to pay more than $200,000 in taxes between 2017 and 2018. And he will serve kind of a 2-year probation for allegedly lying about his drug use on a background check form when purchasing a gun. So, the Justice Department has actually been investigating Hunter Biden for roughly 5 years now. The Justice Department's investigation has been led by David Weiss. This is the he was the U.S. attorney in Delaware. At the time that he was basically put in charge of this investigation, he was recommended by the state's Delaware's 2 Democratic senators. He was nominated by former President Donald Trump, and he was confirmed via a voiced vote by a Republican-controlled Senate. So what we have is a very bipartisan figure, right? If Republicans and Democrats are in support of his kind of being in charge of this investigation, then it's a pretty, I think, something to take note of, right? It's going to be hard for one side to claim that this was partisan if the guy put in charge of it was by a bipartisan figure. Now, Weiss's probe, his investigation, initially kind of was very broad. It included allegations of foreign lobbying, influence peddling, and money laundering. So Hunter Biden has a history of kind of being a shady figure and a reputation of being a shady figure. It's been alleged that he has used his name and his position as being the son of who was once the vice president to benefit himself. He's allegedly taken money from foreign countries, kind of in promises in exchange for, hey, I'll get you a meeting with Joe Biden. Maybe I'll try to influence him to help you out or get what you want done. So that's kind of were the initial allegations. But the investigation kind of narrowed to not include really those allegations and narrowed kind of last fall to focus on essentially what would eventually be reached in the plea deal, the tax and the firearm charges. So this plea deal, Hunter Biden essentially consented to enter a diversion program. So this is similar to probation. It's just what takes place, basically probation before a kind of trial has happened. He will reportedly need to stay sober for 24 months and forego guns for life, not own any more guns, to abide by the parameters of the diversion program. So it is important to note, though, that a judge still needs to sign off on this plea deal. So it's not in effect yet. A judge has to sign off on it. So as you can imagine, this is Hunter Biden is likely to not face any jail time. He could. There's a potential he could. If the kind of system wants to punish him to the extreme. I mean, he could face prison time, but he almost certainly won't. And as you can imagine, many Republicans saw this as kind of a sweetheart deal that the Biden administration, because the Justice Department is a wing of the executive branch, that the Biden administration was corrupt, the Biden crime family, so to speak, was saving its own, and that here we have, Donald Trump, and he's being prosecuted and indicted, and his house is being raided, but Hunter Biden here is not. Now, I want to address those, okay? It's important, and I'm going to say this multiple times because it's important. Different crimes and different cases lead to different outcomes. Let me say it again. Different crimes and different cases lead to different outcomes. That should be obvious, okay? But apparently it isn't too many. So Hunter Biden and Donald Trump broke 2 different crimes, okay? That's important to note. And they both handled their cases significantly different. Hunter Biden has cooperated with the investigation, apparently, and reportedly. He has paid back the taxes that he owed. Donald Trump did not just was not accused of tax evasion, but of national security issues. Okay? Classified documents. I think that's a bigger deal personally. And did not cooperate with the investigation. And still is not cooperating with the investigation by handing over documents, okay? Well, I guess they've already taken them at this point, but he's not cooperating because he's still in denial that this ever happened or that he was in the wrong. So, of course, there's different outcomes. There's 2 different crimes that were broken, and there's 2 different cases. Not to mention that gun crimes, and I actually think this is an issue that should be addressed, but nonetheless, it's true that gun crimes in this country are not prosecuted, okay? Like something like 3% of gun crimes are actually prosecuted in this country, meaning that, if you kind of low-level gun, you give a gun to someone illegally, okay? That's likely going to go unprosecuted. It just is. There's other people have lied on their background check forms, and those crimes have gone unprosecuted. Now, I don't think that's right. I think they should be prosecuted. In fact, what I think this looks bad for Biden is that you are this kind of claim that you are against doing everything you can to end gun violence. Well, then if you are, then you need to actually prosecute gun cases. Like, we need to, if we want to actually stop gun violence, then we need to stop the fact that illegal guns or gun crimes are going unprosecuted. Now, the reason why they're going unprosecuted is because Democratic prosecutors in major cities don't want to prosecute them because it's going to lead to disproportionate outcomes because that it will lead to more African Americans being prosecuted and facing jail time if they actually took gun crimes serious. So that's why they want to eliminate that discrepancy and that what they view as inequity in the system. But when you do that, you're going to not prosecute gun crimes like you should. So you could even claim Hunter Biden, just by the nature of, even though the gun charge was dropped, so to speak, just the fact that he could, if he doesn't abide by the diversion program, that he could still face those gun charges, means that he's being treated more harshly than a lot of gun criminals in this country. Because a lot of the ones that are charged and prosecuted is the result of kind of a larger case, right? They want to tack on more time, or they want to, get a criminal that they can't really prove he's done other stuff, but they kind of suspect he has, so they kind of want to tack on gun charges. So you could even make the case that maybe he's being overcharged compared to just the median gun case in the country. Again, I don't think that's right. I think they should all be prosecuted, but I don't think it's the product of corruption. I'm open to be proven wrong, but I just don't think that's the case. Moving on to declining math scores, I want to talk about this quickly. So it came out this week that the National Assessment of Educational Progress came out, which is essentially it's known as kind of the nation's report card, how are students doing. And there was a 9-point decline of the average math score of 13-year-olds compared to last year. This is the largest drop in 20 years. So this is a product of the pandemic, where you have students that were out of school for year plus, many months, if not a year, and they didn't get the education that previous students have, and they are behind. And this is a big deal. And I think this is a big deal. This was a known outcome, especially when you had public schools and other school across the country not opening because of COVID. We knew this was going to happen, but I think this is significant because this is the biggest drop from 22 last year to 23, right? So we're getting further out of the pandemic, right? We should, theoretically, no longer be seeing declines, okay? That damage has been done, right? Aren't we making progress in recovery? Turns out, no. And that's because, and this is something that some people were talking about, not a whole lot of people were talking about, is the long-term effects of this. It turns out education and things like math build on itself, right? If you never learn how to add, the rest of math is going to be very hard. So if we have a segment of students, the vast majority of students maybe, that didn't learn a part of math that previous students have, then this trend of declining math scores is only going to continue, which means I think this is going to become a political issue because school choice is going to be in demand. It's going to increase in the demands. Voters are going to increase their demands that politicians support school choice initiatives. Right now, it's a conservative and a Republican issue. It will not remain that way. Democratic politicians are going to have to face the reality that Democratic parents care about education as well. And because I think school choice provides the best educational opportunity and outcomes for students, then I think you're going to see a push, which that'll split the Democratic Party, because a huge Democratic base, part of the Democratic base, and one of the most powerful segments is the teacher union across the country, the teacher unions across the country who are opposed to school choice. So keep an eye out for that. Now, international news. The vast majority, what are we at? Okay, so the vast majority of this segment, I want to focus on Russia and Russia's what's going on in Russia. So this actually all happened overnight. So right now I'm recording Saturday, June 24th, and overnight, essentially, you had this situation pop off in Russia. So what exactly is happening and what has happened so far? I wanted to just go ahead and put an asterisk by everything I'm going to say. We are dealing with an autocratic regime, a dictatorship that has essentially ended free press in this country. Okay, Russia does not really allow free press at all. Not only that, but is continually pumping out propaganda and misinformation. So we have to be very careful about what we believe, and we're left in the dark about a lot. But nonetheless, there's absolutely something is happening in Russia, and so I'm going to try and explain what exactly we know and what is going on. So in Russia, you have this. So you have Putin, right? Putin's at the top. He's the man in charge. And Putin, like other autocrats, essentially to prevent coups, okay, set up people around him that, number one, are loyal to him. So it doesn't really matter if you're qualified, but if you're loyal to Putin and he can trust you, you're qualified, right? That's what makes you qualified. So Putin has surrounded himself by loyal people, right? That's obvious. But what he also, what other autocratic regimes do, is amongst those loyal supporters, you kind of divide up power and pin all of these different power brokers against one another, right? So you have maybe 5 people that you really trust, that you give them all power, but you make sure that they're all kind of suspect of the others. And so what that means is if any of them try to step out of line, they're quickly checked by the others. Ironically, it's kind of similar to a checks and balance kind of approach of the United States. So that's what you do, right? So Putin's kind of done that, and so there's a lot of different entities and power brokers in Russia that he is basically, that all, and this is the important part, all depend on Putin for their source of power, right? So they're not independently powerful. They're powerful because Putin is powerful, which is what makes them want to check others that want to eliminate Putin's power. Well, one of those kind of people in Russia is the head of the Wagner Group, W-A-G-N-E-R, the Wagner Group. So the Wagner Group is essentially a Russian mercenary army that's been fighting in Ukraine. It's led by this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and Prigozhin has been is basically the leader of this private military in Russia. Okay, so it's mercenary. So it's not the Russian military. It stands outside the Russian military, but it's under the lead of the charge of this guy who Putin trusts and is loyal to Putin, supposedly, right? So the Wagner Group became well known throughout Russia because they were vital in the war in Syria. Prigozhin and the Wagner Group was very brutal. They supported the Syrian government in that battle, in that conflict, and they were fighting on behalf of Russia's interest. So Prigozhin was very successful. He basically, and brutal, he demolished cities, eradicated populations. I mean, he was brutal, and his goal was to basically weaken the rebels so much that they were unable to continue to fight. And make sure that civilians suffered a cost if they supported them. So he became well known, and with the Russian invasion, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group have played a central role in fighting the Ukrainians, and particularly the East. So what happened during the Russian counteroffensive earlier this year? They were fighting, and it was very unsuccessful. It was widely reported on, and the one city that they took was the city of Bakhmut. This is in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians gave the Russians a very intense fight for the city of Bakhmut. Now, the city of Bakhmut actually it has no strategic significance militarily. All it was symbolic. Russia was not successful in their counteroffensive led by the Wagner Group. So this was kind of their saving grace as they got the city of Bakhmut. But in the process, Prigozhin and the Wagner group, they were basically run dry of ammunition. They lost a ton of people. And you started to see some frustration. And so Prigozhin, during this Battle of Bakhmut, started posting videos criticizing the military elites and military brass of Russia. Now, this was a big deal at the time because no one criticizes the guys in charge, right? You can't do that in Russia. So his criticisms of them were a big deal. Now, a lot of people were like, well, he's still loyal to Putin, and, he essentially knows what he's doing. He's walking a fine line, but he's not going overboard, or Putin wouldn't let him do this. Putin basically is okay with this because he wouldn't be doing it otherwise. Well, that may not have been the case because Prigozhin, basically overnight, okay, he claimed that the Russian military bureaucrats misled Putin into fighting the pointless conflict. He accused the Russian government forces of striking his men and inflicting numerous casualties, basically a missile strike on his group, and basically declared open war against the military brass of Russia. The Russian security services, in response, opened a criminal case against Prigozhin for instigating a coup and issued a warrant for his arrest. And so Prigozhin, as you can imagine, said no and basically said, I'm going to take this to the top. I'm going to come back into Russia. I'm going to take the city of Rostov, and I'm going to march my army all the way to Moscow, and I'm going to handle this myself. And he basically declared open war against Putin and his regime. Reports started trickling out that, and so in response to these kind of threats that Prigozhin was making, Putin and the military brass told the kind of people on the border of Ukraine and Russia, don't let Prigozhin and the Wagner group back through. It didn't matter. The Wagner group crossed into Russia. They left Ukraine, marched back into Russia, basically didn't face any resistance. They got to the city of Rostov. Now, Rostov is a really important city. Rostov is the largest city in southern Russia and is the capital of the Rostov region, and it's connected to parts of eastern Ukraine where the war is raging. It is just 60 miles from Ukraine's border and, importantly, is home to the Russian Southern Military District Command, whose 58th Combined Armies are located. Okay? So this is a major center of the Ukrainian war. Now, he takes the city of Rostov. Reports come out that he takes them, and not only takes the city, but actually takes the military installations and sites there, including an airfield. He was in the actual headquarters of the army itself. He threatened to blockade the city and threatened to head to Moscow unless Putin and other military generals decided to come to Rostov and meet him there. They obviously didn't, and now reports are that he has started to make his way to Moscow. So there's a lot of, again, speculation that part of what he's doing is he is trying to get to Moscow as quickly as possible because he's trying to limit the reinforcements. Now, the issues with this, the route from Rostov to Moscow is geographically is very difficult. There's basically one road, and that road is M4. It has basically been closed. The Russian military has started to set up defense posts all along the road. So there's going to be fighting. Okay, it's inevitable at this point that there's going to be fighting. Now, a couple of outcomes that are likely. Number one, the Russian military could just eradicate Wagner Group. Now, if they're powerful enough, then Putin and the Russian military will do that. It's questionable about whether they're powerful enough to do that. And there's questions about what about the Russian people, right? This is basically right now a fight between Russian elites, the military commanders versus Prigozhin. So where do the people lie? Because I think, and a lot of people are speculating, that what Prigozhin is banking on is that as he marches his way to Moscow, he's joined by all sorts of civilians, and that there's a real revolution, so to speak, in Russia. Or does it stay a fight between elites? That's an important question that's going to have to be answered. But maybe the military generals are able to eradicate this threat, and even if that happens, what this still proves is the weakness of Putin. This doesn't happen in a regime or a government that is strong, under a ruler that has the support of the people and of the elites. This only happens in a regime that is weak. And so we see the weakness of the Putin regime. Now, another outcome is they march their way to Moscow. They inevitably lose, but they prolong the fight. So it's a prolonged civil war, essentially. That's could be an outcome. That Russia basically has to fight a civil war within its own country. And I'll get to what that means for Ukraine in a little bit. Finally, another outcome is this is successful. Prigozhin actually overthrows the Putin regime. I think that's unlikely, and a lot of people I've read and listened to think that's the most unlikely outcome, but it's a lot more likely now than it was maybe 48 hours ago. So a couple of effects. So obviously, almost regardless of the outcome of the three that I just mentioned, you're going to have the effects in Russia are going to be felt. That's inevitable. But I want to talk about some other kind of things to keep an eye on. The first is Belarus. So Belarus, and Lukashenko is the dictator in Belarus. He is essentially and has been a Putin puppet. And Russia has been using Belarus as a kind of a launching pad to conduct its war in Ukraine. Well, there's a lot of Belarusian democratic forces. They obviously aren't in charge, but Lukashenko isn't necessarily, loved in Belarus. Does this conflict, the potential, mutiny that we have in Russia, spill over into Belarus? If it does, maybe Lukashenko is having to deal with his own internal conflict, or maybe they're successful and they overthrow Lukashenko. So let's say that Russia successfully takes down Wagner Group. Well, if this spills over into Belarus, that could limit Russia's future success in Ukraine if they can't necessarily trust or use Belarus as a launching pad anymore. The other thing is Ukraine itself, right? What does this mean for the Ukrainian war? Right now, Ukraine has been in the middle of a counteroffensive. And now, in the middle of that counteroffensive, when they're already kind of focusing their attack on Russia and being aggressive against Russia, Russia is now experiencing this inner turmoil. If this is a prolonged civil war, then this is a real issue for Russia and a real success for Ukraine, because that is very difficult to fight a foreign war and a war at home. And so if that were to happen, Ukraine would be in a very good spot. But kind of short term, what kind of advantage, how do they take advantage of this internal turmoil during its counteroffensive? How do they take advantage of this turmoil? That's going to be a huge question that we're going to start to see. I do want to just make one note. Tom Nichols, he writes for The Atlantic. He's kind of a Russian expert. And he wrote, quote, "Think of this conflict not as a contest between the Russian state and a mercenary group, but of a falling out among gangsters, a kind of mafia war." And I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm not rooting for Prigozhin. I'm not rooting for the Wagner Group. I'm not rooting for Putin. I'm not rooting for anybody. They're all corrupt, terrible, wicked, thuggish people, okay? In fact, Wagner Group, if Prigozhin were to be in charge and get control of Russia, would probably just execute the war against Ukraine even more aggressively. So I don't think this is necessarily either side. I'm not rooting for either side. But the turmoil itself is really, really big deal. And I think is why the Western aid given by Western countries to Ukraine was a good idea to begin with. Imagine, go back a year and a half ago, in February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Ukraine is able to fight off the Russian army for a few days, few weeks, maybe even a few months. But eventually, because without the aid of the Western world, Ukraine is eventually kind of gives way to the just sheer mass of the Russian army. Russia takes Ukraine. Yeah, it may take longer than they thought. Yeah, it may have been more deadly and costly than they thought, but eventually they do. That, I think, is the likely outcome if the Western world does not give aid to Ukraine. Now, after a year and a half of giving aid to Ukraine, the war is still prolonged, the war is still going on, and as a result, Russia is in turmoil. One scenario, the first, the Western world doesn't give aid, Russia is stronger and the Putin regime is stronger. He now has a notch in his belt that he's taken Ukraine. Russia now has a larger population, a resource-rich region of the world. He's now closer to other NATO countries. It's strategically more powerful. Now, because of Western aid, a major adversary of the United States is weakened at the cost of 0 lives lost, American lives lost, and a very small percent of our budget being spent. Compared to how we spend our resources, a very small percent of that budget is going to help Ukraine fight. Very small budget. So if I had said a year and a half ago, for a small percent of our budget being spent and 0 lives lost, you can weaken a major adversary of the United States. I think everybody would do that. That's the argument for Ukraine aid. It's really easy to say, why are we sending millions and billions of dollars to Ukraine? We could use that for other stuff. This is why. This wasn't predicted necessarily. We couldn't be sure that this was going to happen the way that it's taken, the way that it has happened. But it was a likely outcome. It was at least a potential outcome and worth the investment. And I think it's paying off as we see. Moving on, these will be quick. On China and Cuba, they have a possible agreement on a base on Cuba. So China and Cuba I talked about last week because their report came out that China has had a surveillance station on Cuba for years at this point. Well, now reports came out this week that they are not just talking about a surveillance station, but now actually negotiating to establish a new joint military training facility on the island. This would obviously be a big deal. Now, it hasn't happened. I think this is important. Discussions are at an advanced stage between China and Cuba, but they have not concluded, and this has not happened. But if it were to happen, this is a big deal because it could lead to the stationing of Chinese troops 100 miles off the coast. So, big deal and something to pay attention to there. Also, this is something that's really gone on the radar, especially with everything else going on. The Panama Canal is in the middle of a drought. In fact, the Panama Canal is going through one of its driest periods in more than 100 years. The lack of rainfall for the Panama Canal could impact global supply chains with delays and higher fees to move cargo. This is because the government agency that manages the canal, has already had to implement travel restrictions to prevent ships from running aground. For example, large vessels have had to reduce container loads by roughly 1/4. The Canal Authority is expected to implement even more restrictions. However, they were actually able to postpone these further restrictions after some much-needed rain happened. Now, this is obviously going to impact global supply chains because a lot of trade goes through the Panama Canal. About 1/3 of Asia to America's seaborne trade goes through the canal. And so the kind of restrictions put in place because of this drought could lead to delays and more expensive goods. This is nothing compared to the supply chain issues that we had during COVID, but the supply chains continue to go through the ringer. Finally, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Washington, went on a state visit on Thursday. President Joe Biden hosted him. This is the first state visit for Modi and the first state visit to America by any Indian prime minister since 2009. Modi took questions from reporters at a joint news conference. This is actually a big deal because he doesn't really do this in his country. He spoke in front of Congress, and the White House hosted a state dinner for him. This was a big deal because India is just an important country in the Chinese-American geopolitical competition. If America and China are going to continue this kind of competition and battle for global supremacy that they've been conducting, that they've been engaged in, then India is going to play an important role in that. India is a nuclear power. India is the most populous country in the world, just past China for the largest population in the world. It has one of the top 5 economies in the world, and that is only looking to grow more as it becomes more efficient. Right now, it's basically big because it has a lot of people, but it could, as it becomes more efficient, it could actually grow to become the most powerful economy in the world. And this comes at a time when Russia and India have had a closer relationship than the United States has hoped for. Russia sells military equipment or has sold military equipment to India. India has been buying Russian oil. And so you kind of have this, and there were a lot of questions about, Modi has some human rights issues to deal with at home. He hasn't been I would argue, the most democratic or liberal, leader in the world by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think this is a good move by Biden, the Biden administration. You want to have a good relationship with India because China is the greater concern. So sometimes you just have to, not necessarily, India is basically leading some discrimination against religious minorities. Basically, the Hindu majority is persecuting and discriminating against others. And so sometimes you just have to make these deals as president because there's a larger threat that you have to address. And I think that's the case. And the potential is, or the hope would be, if we build these relationships, liberalize trade with India, then they will democratize and liberalize like the United States. With that, that is the podcast this week. So please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide. And I will hope to see you again next week.